Okay, Simon, I'm going to start. So, floor is yours in 3, 2.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you all for attending this webinar today on international aviation emissions and how we might limit them. My name is Simon Roach. I'm a reporter at ENS Europe. We're an environmental news service. Now, in way of brief introduction to the topic, emissions from international aviation are projected to increase by 300% by 2050 if left unchecked, which would be far out the ambition of the Paris Climate Agreement from December. So it's been left under the auspices of ICAO, the UN Civil Aviation Organization, to work out some measures and mechanisms to limit those emissions. So countries will be coming together in October to agree on a global market-based mechanism which will seek to limit or give carbon neutral growth beyond 2020. There's a high-level meeting where countries will be coming together to try and work through some of the politically sensitive issues next week in Montreal, where officials will be discussing the latest draft deal. Now there's lots of things to discuss. So we kindly got 3 experts with us today to try and lead us through some of the sensitivities and some of the specific issues. We've got Andrew Murphy from Transport and Environment, who will be speaking about the general ambition of the aviation deal and how it can contribute to keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. And we've got Kat Watts from Carbon Market Watch, who will be taking us through some of the more technical elements of the mechanisms, such as price, registries, and quality standards. And last but not least, we've got Hannah Moat from Fern, who will be talking about the environmental credibility of some of the offset credits that might be included in the GMBM and why red should be kept out. Each panelist will be speaking for approximately 15 minutes, during which time attendees can submit any questions that they have through the question section of the software, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end where we'll put those questions to the panelists. I should also say that there's an open letter to the ICAO parties that's being circulated, which I think will come up in the chat box and will also be sent to all the attendees after the workshop's finished. So you can have a look at that, and if anyone would like to sign that, they can do so. Great. So I think now if Andrew would like to kick us off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Simon, for that introduction. I'm Andrew Murphy from Brussels-based Transport and Environment. TNE has been around 25 years, works on all transport modes, obviously I've focused on aviation. TNE is a member of the International Coalition for Sustainable Aviation, which has observer status to ICAO's Environmental Committee, and so has been closely involved in measures at the European level and in efforts at ICAO level to address aviation's climate impact. So to begin with, just outlining aviation's current climate impact and its expected growth rates in the coming decades to highlight what the scale of the problem is. So at present, aviation, both domestic and international, is responsible for an estimated 4.9% of global warming. That is the CO2 emissions plus the non-CO2 effects of aviation. Aviation, because of where the emissions occur at a high altitude, it has a relatively large, though short-term, regional impact in terms of additional climate impact. And if you want more information on this non-CO2, I recommend reading David Lee's work on some of this. So we estimate combined domestic and international about 4.9%. And the science continues to evolve on that. To put another way, the CO2 impact of international aviation, it's equivalent to about the CO2 impact of Germany, or if you want to put it another way, it's equivalent to the lowest 129 emitting states in the world, so a considerable impact. As Simon said in the beginning, the growth rates for international aviation, if no action is taken, is somewhere between 300% and 400%. Obviously, up to 2050. Obviously, those growth rates vary a lot, but the idea is that as more countries develop economically, their aviation sectors will develop along with that, and that growth will continue for quite some time. And you can see that in some of the projections for aircraft orders, or for some of the national projections for how quickly their aviation markets are going to grow. So currently, these aviation emissions, they're not included in national emissions targets. When the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated in the 1990s, states had a difficult time in deciding how to allocate aviation emissions, how to allocate aviation and shipping emissions to each state. So they agreed to leave them aside, and they requested the International Civil Aviation Organization to limit or reduce emissions from shipping, and equally to request the International Maritime Organization to limit or reduce emissions from shipping. We at TNE will be somewhat critical of the work that ICAO have done to date in achieving this objective. What we would say is the wording of the Kyoto language wasn't exactly ideal. It asked developed parties to work through ICAO to reduce the climate impact of aviation. That's quite difficult for ICAO, where ICAO doesn't recognize the developing distinction, and that has been a barrier to progress since the Kyoto language was adopted in the late 1990s. So to look more closely at how aviation is going to grow, and why we should be so concerned about the growth rate, this graph is taken from some of the estimates that have been produced by ICAO. As you can see, there will be some operational improvements, so the completion of the single European sky, perhaps China setting aside more of its airspace for civil aviation use as opposed to military aviation use. Those offer some potentials. The ICAO CAPE earlier this year adopted the first ever CO2 efficiency standard for new aircraft. I could go into more detail on that. It's not exactly an ideal standard. It requires aircraft to improve efficiency by about 4% by the time it kicks into full effect in 2028. So its impact isn't going to be huge, and we would hope that it can be updated over time. What you don't see on the graph is any mention of alternative fuels. That's partly because it's very hard to predict how much alternative fuels, in particular sustainable alternative fuels, will become available in the long term, in the medium to long term. So for example, the EU had a target of 2 million tons of alternative fuels in 2020. A few weeks ago, they downgraded that estimate from 2 million tons to 0.05. So there's issues around availability of sustainable alternative fuels. And also there is a price gap between the current price of alternative fuels and the price of oil, which is disincentivizing some of the uptake. There are exciting technological developments on a small scale in recent years. There is the potential that in years to come there could be more sustainable alternative fuels, but right now it's something of a guessing game as to what their availability will be in the years to come. So one other thing that needs to be taken into account is the current low oil price, which is having an impact on the efficiencies of the aviation sector. The aviation industry will always say that fossil fuel and fuel takes up a huge share of airlines' operating cost, and so therefore it already has an incentive to produce the most efficient aircraft, to fly them most efficiently. That is true, but as oil prices stay low or continue to decline, that incentive will fade away. And in other transport modes, such as cars, for example, those sectors are covered by technology forcing CO2 standards. They are covered by a fuel tax. Their emissions are included in national inventories. So there's an incentive to reduce those emissions even if the price of oil falls low. The issue with the aviation sector is we are peculiarly reliant on high oil prices to drive fuel efficiencies in that sector. Without high oil prices or some other measures in place, those incentives aren't there. And that's going to become quite relevant in the post-Paris environment. So for example, if we have a shift towards electric mobility over the coming 10 years, that could reduce demand for oil by up to 2 million barrels a day. And that could see us enter a period of continued low oil prices, and that needs to be accounted for. And what we're seeing from some aircraft operators is that they are preferring to lease more fuel-inefficient second-hand aircraft than spend money buying more fuel-efficient new aircraft, and that will have an impact on both passenger growth of the sector and the efficiency savings. So just to relate this all back to the Paris ambition, as I'm sure many of the people on the call will be familiar with, Paris set out well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit an increase in temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And under Article 4, it says parties will aim to reach a global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. When Paris Agreement was being negotiated, there was a lot of discussion around the role of international aviation and shipping. Because they weren't included in the NDCs, we believe they required a specific mention in the Paris Agreement itself. That wasn't achieved, but what is in the Paris Agreement is wording that there needs to be a balance in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades. And so therefore, international aviation emissions must be addressed and must be included. And the target itself will be, if not impossible, then close to impossible to achieve without a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so to give one example of what would happen, if other parts of the economy reduce their emissions in line with a 2-degree trajectory, international aviation emissions, if they continue on the current trajectory, would account for about 22% of emissions in 2015. So to talk about what the current goals and aspirations are that in place, at its 2010 Triennial Assembly, ICAO's assembly meets every 3 years, ICAO adopted a target of carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards. And it stated that it would achieve these through a basket of measures, starting with 2% fleet-wide fuel efficiency per year, incentivizing alternative fuels, and it made a reference to the GMBM. At the 2013 Assembly, that was upgraded to a commitment to agree a GMBM in 2016, which would come into operation from 2021. Industry has been more ambitious in what it's set out to achieve. It wants to stabilize emissions at 2020 levels, but going beyond that, it wants to reduce emissions 50% by 2050 based on 2005 levels. And if you want more information on what industry is proposing and how it believes it can achieve that, you can go to atag.org, where there'll be more information. But what I would say is sometimes when I discuss these targets with industry, sometimes they refer to them as a goal, and other times they refer to them as an aspiration. And there is a view that the 50% by 2050 target will be achieved conditional on there being sufficient alternative fuels or conditional on sufficient technological developments. So it's not sort of an absolute binding goal. It's a goal slash aspiration. So the immediate measure which is in front of us, which is due to be adopted at the ICAO Assembly this October, is a global market-based mechanism which will stabilize net emissions at 2020 levels. This was the agreement adopted at the 2013 Assembly, and it followed a political diplomatic dispute between the EU and I would say the rest of the world when the EU moved to include international aviation to and from the EU in its own emissions trading scheme and face objections from other countries based on extraterritoriality aspect on this, the absence of differentiation being included, and the agreement was the EU suspended for the most part aviation's inclusion in its ETS, and in return parties agreed to work through ICAO to develop a global mechanism. That has to be adopted in October of this year with sufficient certainty that it will come into operation starting in 2021. What's interesting about the 2013 Assembly is that 50 states objected to the 2020 target, 44 because it wasn't ambitious enough and they were mostly European. 6 other states said 2020 is too ambitious, and among those states, so 6 states, that includes China. So we at TNE and ICSA would be critical of the 2020 target. Our view is that it's an insufficient contribution to the 2-degree objective, let alone well below 2.5 degrees or 1.5 degrees. A study conducted for the European Parliament Environment Committee found that it is a 55% deviation from the 2% target. So our view is that we're hoping for a successful ICAO assembly where the GMBM is adopted, but that must be a starting point for further ambition. So to look at the current draft GMBM, ICAO Council President Alioui circulated a draft proposal in December that was made public in April. It was discussed in a series of regional meetings around the world and updated ahead of next week's high-level meeting in Montreal, when 190 states will seek to reach a further consensus on what the GMBM will look like. In the discussions we've been involved in, the huge issue is how do you reconcile the climate principle of differentiation with ICAO's very strict principle of non-discrimination. So the principle of differentiation that developed countries should do more than developing countries, perhaps we're all familiar with. The ICAO principle, which is enshrined in its Chicago Convention, says that state operators must be treated equally regardless of where they are registered. So if two operators are on the same route, they must be treated the same. And that's made it a little bit difficult to address differentiation. What the current draft proposes is to exempt a number of states for the first 5 years of a scheme, and then to exempt a smaller number of states for the period of the scheme onwards. On the current draft, about 100 plus states would be exempt from the first 5 years. That includes most and not all of Africa. Some states with obviously very minimal aviation emissions. It also includes larger states such as Brazil, Mexico, South Africa. And as a result, you're exempting flights both from those states and to those states. And as a result, at least for the first 5 years, our estimate is that it's quite a large exemption, possibly up to 40% of the emissions that should have been covered by the global MBM will now be exempt. And a smaller percentage will be exempt for the period beyond 2026 when more countries are included. So it's problematic because what the draft also says is that these emissions which are excluded from the GMBM won't be compensated for elsewhere in the scheme. It's known as the principle of no redistribution, and it's been there since the December draft and remains in the current draft. It's problematic because when the UNFCCC was evaluating the INDCs in December, no INDC included international aviation emissions. So to see how the INDCs put us on a track to 2 or 1.5 degrees, the UNFCCC had to make an estimate for aviation emissions. So it chose carbon neutral growth 2020 because that was the target agreed to by ICAO. If parties in ICAO fail to agree to carbon neutral growth from 2020, therefore we're either pushed further away from 1.52 degrees, which obviously goes against the purpose of the Paris Agreement, or alternatively, states themselves will have to compensate by adopting greater ambition to make up for the absence of ambition from the ICAO scheme. And so that's why in this slide I refer to it as the myth of no redistribution. There is redistribution. The question is, do you redistribute within the international aviation sector, or do you redistribute to states outside of the international aviation sector? And so therefore our message for the ICAO Assembly in October is that we have to minimize the size of the exemptions. Some of those large aviation states need to be included for the first 5 years. And also that there needs to be a mechanism in place to compensate for those exemptions, or at least for the vast majority of those exemptions. And then to conclude, as we say, 2020 is only ever a starting point. The purpose of the Paris Agreement is that you increase ambition over time in line with 1.52 degrees. And that's the message we want to come out of the ICAO Assembly in October, to adopt a GMBM that has 2020 as its binding goal and a recognition that that can be increased over time. That's obviously an increased level of ambition, but from our perspective, there's a number of ways you can seek to achieve that. So you can increase the ambition of the GMBM itself on regular intervals. You can do that by increasing the target, by discounting. So over time, instead of buying 1 offset or allowance, you buy 2 offsets or 1.5 or 3, and you increase it through discounting. You pursue more aggressive in-sector emission reductions. At present, the GMBM will rely almost exclusively on offsetting, which is problematic in a post-Paris environment where all sectors need to reduce their emissions. So what ICAO could do is adopt a more effective CO2 efficiency standard. It could support either globally or regionally the introduction of a fuel tax, which would incentivize further technology developments. We would also say that we don't believe that global measures alone may be able to achieve this. It's also worthwhile looking at whether national or regional ambition can also play a role in increasing international aviation's climate ambition. So for example, the retention of EU ETS in some form as an addition or complementary to the global MBM. And so finally, before concluding and moving on to Kat, I would say we need to look at the ICAO GMBM and the Assembly in October not as a sort of ceiling in ambition, but a floor from ambition. Much like the Paris Agreement, it should launch ambition which will increase over time. And also this fits with ICAO's role in the area of safety and security, because currently ICAO play a role where they set a minimum safety and security standards, and states can and do go beyond that. We think in October they should set a minimum environmental and climate standard by adopting a global MBM based on 2020 levels. And ICAO or regions or states should, from there on, increase ambition over time in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Simon again here for anyone that's just joined. That was a really useful overview, I guess, or putting ICAO and the GMBM in the context of the wider array of global emissions reduction measures. Just to remind anyone that you can just be putting in questions via the question box throughout, and we can see all those coming up, and we'll put them to the floor at the end. So whether they're specifically for one panelist as they're speaking or more general, we can go over those at the end. So yeah, thanks, Andrew. Next we have Kat Watts, who's going to be talking a little bit more about some of the specifics of the GMBM. So thanks, Kat.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I'm Kat Watts. I'm Carbon Market Watch's Global Climate Policy Advisor, and I'll be talking about some of the elements that we see as essential to the success of ICAO's carbon offsetting scheme for international aviation. And I'll be focusing, although there are many issues that we're looking at, I'll be focusing on avoiding double counting, looking at the credit quality standards, and the need for transparency. Excuse me. So, starting with avoiding double counting, this is an issue that can occur in several ways. First of all, there's double claiming, where the same emission reduction is counted twice by both the buyer and the seller. This wasn't historically a problem so much under the Clean Development Mechanism and the Kyoto Protocol, where you had a clear division between developed countries that would buy credits and developing countries that would sell credits but didn't have obligations. But as developing countries have come on board with more and more actions that they're bringing to the table to limit global warming, it does create more complexity and a greater need for mechanisms to set good accounting rules and to have good frameworks in place to stop that happening. There's also an issue around double issuance, where multiple offsets for the same emissions reduction occur either from the same offset program or from different offset programs, so that you would have one project potentially giving selling credits to different programs. And again, this is an area where you need to make sure that the projects and programs have transparent rules in place to avoid this happening. So why is double counting important? Avoiding double counting important? Well, again, we go back to the essential need for keeping the integrity of global climate action and to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if you're counting an emissions reduction more than once, then you're basically cheating the atmosphere. You're not accounting for what's actually going up. And so you're really diluting the chances that we will be able to stay within the global carbon budgets that are consistent with staying below 1.5 degrees. And the importance of avoiding double counting is very well recognized within the climate and the carbon market communities. It appears 5 times in the Paris decisions. It appears once in the Paris Treaty itself as an obligation that needs to be fulfilled. Now, how they'll do this is something that will be negotiated in the next few years, but there's a lot of existing experience that can be built on, largely from the UNFCCC itself, but also from other experiences in other carbon markets. The problem is that, as I alluded to, since Cancun and the developing countries have been putting forward pledges, and the new pledges that we have for Paris, the intended nationally determined contributions, there's a wide variety of types of pledges. It's not just that more and more countries are coming on board with pledges of different types. It means that in some countries not all emissions are covered, not all have economy-wide targets or economy-wide actions. Some countries have different types of target that might be energy efficiency or renewables targets as their contribution to the climate effort. And this makes the accounting very, very much more complicated, and this is something that the UNFCCC will be working out, but it shows how complex the world has now become compared to how it was in the early Kyoto days. And this means that there's an essential need to track emissions if they are traded, and this will require systems to be put in place. And so avoiding double counting in ICAO's MBM, this market-based measure. First of all, it's essential that there are establishment of transparent means to track the emissions reductions and credit use. This will be essential for the integrity and also for the positive perception of the market-based measure. And whatever details the system comes up with, it must ensure that double counting of credits is not possible. And this is probably best done by establishing a comprehensive registries that are synchronized with the registry of every eligible credit program that is allowed to be used towards the MBM. Although there's still a lot of uncertainty on how all these different pieces will fit together, it does seem fairly clear that synchronizing the registries with the UNFCCC will be the easiest, as the UNFCCC will be the most comprehensive system. It will be looking at the entire national registries and the registries of all climate communications, as well as anything that's happening on the global carbon markets. And it's also the largest potential source of credits through the new Sustainable Development Mechanism that's been established as part of the Paris Agreement. Ensuring no double counting from the voluntary market with respect to these INDCs will be more complicated because it's just that little bit harder, or you're relying more on the national level to make sure that a project being done under the voluntary market isn't being counted towards the INDCs, and so you will need to put mechanisms in place if voluntary market credits are to be used. Turning now to the credit quality standards, the MBM is actually an excellent opportunity for the aviation industry to support zero or low carbon sustainable development in other sectors in the near term. As Andrew was alluding to, there isn't a lot of room in the global carbon budgets if we are to try and stay below 1.5 degrees. And so what we need to be doing is, in all sectors, but some sectors first, moving as rapidly as possible towards zero or low carbon development. And as well as the Paris Agreement, last year the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed, so all countries that might act as a host for generating offsets will not only be seeking to do their own bit towards climate change and carbon reductions, but they'll also be looking to generate their own sustainable development co-benefits on that. And the only way that this MBM is going to be to seize that opportunity of contributing towards this goal of zero and low carbon sustainable development is if ICAO adopts stringent and mandatory eligibility for offset credits that are common to all countries, that ensure that only carbon credits with high environmental and social integrity are actually eligible for use in the MBM. First of all, it would be great, it's very, very important that in the ICAO Assembly resolution there is a political agreement that there should be a negative list of ineligible project types, not just programs, which is something that's under discussion at the moment, whether decisions are taken at the programmatic level or whether you look below that. And we feel it's absolutely essential that we look at project types, because there is quite a large literature that shows that certain project types are quite problematic, and I'll talk about that more on my next slide. We also feel that it's essential that projects should actually actively contribute to the host country's sustainable development, not just that they shouldn't do any harm, but that they're an active contribution, because if aviation is still in a mode where it's offsetting rather than going for real emissions reductions at this stage, then it's incredibly important that the best quality credits are being used and that these are having the best outcomes on the ground. Including these criteria in the ICAO Assembly resolution will be important to send a very strong political signal and send a message to the ICAO systems as they develop these negative lists or make choices about which project types or programs are eligible, that there is a very strong political message going forward that the negative list is important, that good quality credits are important, that sustainable development is important, but also that the emissions reductions are permanent. And as a final point on this slide, we feel that only credits from post-2020 should be eligible within the MBM. This is for two main reasons. First, that the emissions reductions are happening at the same time as they're being claimed to be happening. But also secondly, it is one way of reducing a lot of the hot air that's built up in the global carbon markets up to 2020. First of all, with mechanisms like joint implementation under the Kyoto Protocol, some of the targets set were very, very low, and so there was a lot of hot air created that way. It was also found in various studies that a lot of the emissions reductions claimed there were not as rigorous as one would expect, and many did not actually represent real emissions reductions. So accepting only credits from post-2020 would be a good means of showing that we've learnt from the lessons of the past, clearing the deck and going forward with the best quality credits and trading systems possible. Returning to that idea of the negative list and why we feel it's so important, first of all, everyone recognises the importance of a negative list. Every ETS that we've looked at has a negative list of some sort that excludes certain types of project. And we feel that the ICAO MBM, and certainly for its own environmental integrity, should exclude certain project types from eligibility. First of all, we think there should be no coal or fossil power plants, not even clean coal, going forward. And this is because we need to be decarbonising to get to zero carbon to be consistent with 1.5. If you're still in the fossil fuel world, you're not building a 1.5 degree world. And even with clean coal, power plants have lifetimes of over 40 years, and that doesn't get you to zero carbon by 2050. Similarly, fossil fuel production is problematic in that much of it releases a lot of methane, another very powerful greenhouse gas. And again, we're still locking into the fossil paradigm rather than moving into the renewables world and true sustainable development. We will also feel that nuclear should be excluded on grounds that it's not additional to business as usual and it can have significant environmental and social harms, as we've seen in a number of countries over the years. With large hydro, again, there are issues around additionality, and often it's not the crediting baseline is not often seen as very credible. There's a very high likelihood of other environmental and social harms, and certainly some of the projects that we're looking at within Carbon Market Watch, there have been notable human rights abuses that have been observed and real powerfully negative social impacts on local people, and this is something that could be really quite a large reputational risk for the aviation industry. Another area that Hannah will talk about in much more depth is the land use change in forestry, including RED as a sector. And for us, this is because of the fundamental difference between biological and fossil carbon. Not all carbon is the same, and not all carbon is equal. Fossil carbon's been locked up in the ground successfully and sustainably for 300 to 360 million years, and it's only since humans have been using it that those emissions from those sources have been released. Whereas biological carbon, and although it's extremely important that we address emissions from biological carbon can be reversed within hours, days, weeks, even a year or two. It's a much faster carbon cycle, and trying to replace something that's successfully locked up on a scale for millions of years and replacing it with something that can be up in a cloud of smoke literally within a day or two is highly problematic in terms of permanence and in terms of other potential social and environmental harms also. There's a large literature on problems around HFC 23 and nitrous oxide from adipic acid production. There's been the Kyoto Protocol and the CDM created very strong perverse incentives and created risks for potential increase in emissions elsewhere. Another problem is that these gases have very strong global warming potentials, and so one tonne is equivalent to a lot of tonnes of CO2, and so it neutralises or waters down quite considerably the effort to decarbonise, which is where the climate efforts need to be focused. We will also feel that CCS is something that should be included on the negative list because of concerns on permanence and the lack of sustainable development co-benefits. And basically, in summary, projects that do not have sustainable development co-benefits or do harm should be excluded. And as a general principle, all eligible carbon offset credits should ensure the protection of human rights, promote sustainable development, and actively do so, and have an accountability mechanism. Now, the only way that you get accountability is through transparency. And whereas within the UNFCCC you have all the information about the CDM and JI on the UNFCCC website, and during the conferences, all the conference room papers are online and accessible to the public. The UNFCCC is relatively open in its processes, although we would have concerns about some of the opportunities for NGOs to be able to participate and actively engage in some of the processes. But the UNFCCC makes but ICAO makes the UNFCCC look like a model of good practice. Now, ICAO does have some areas of work where secrecy is justified, for instance in security, but this is an area where it really, really needs to open up and change its current modus operandi. Because markets need transparency to function, all actors need the confidence that other actors are doing what they're saying they're doing, that they're acting well, that they're acting as strongly as they said they would, that they're fulfilling the obligations. You also need transparency to ensure that there's no double counting of credits, and you also need transparency to ensure that good quality credits are being used by all players. And again, this goes back to the confidence between actors. But it's not just a question of confidence. I mean, it's something that has tangible impacts within the real world. It was the lack of transparency in the data in the EU ETS first year that led to a price collapse, for instance, and it was only when the data became available that in the second period of trading that there was much more clarity on what was going on and the prices rose again. And so we would call on ICAO to ensure that there's public access to the governance meetings and that all data are put on the ICAO website in a public area as they are for the CDM. Because the public needs confidence that the MBM is not greenwash. They need to see that good quality credits are being used, that they're not being double counted, that the airlines are doing what they're saying they're doing. But I think it's also very important to recognise that these activities on the ground, these mitigation projects from which ICAO will be claiming their offsets, do affect people. And Carbon Market Watch was set up to monitor as a way of bridging the impacts on people on the ground and the reports that we were getting through them, and bringing that to the UNFCCC to say this project type is problematic or there are real problems with this particular project and the way it's being implemented. It's not fulfilling the rules, or that there are significant impacts that we hadn't considered that need to be brought into the rules. And this kind of transparency and feedback from stakeholders will also be essential, again, for ICAO's, the MBM's credibility. Because if there are problematic projects, it's better that ICAO hear about them and deal with them and have a mechanism to do so than it goes out into the media and becomes a reputational problem for ICAO or the airlines. So in short, what we need is for the agreement to ensure that there are strong mechanisms put in place to avoid double counting. This is essential for environmental integrity. Similarly, we're not going to get to 1.5 degrees unless the best quality credits are used, the ones that are additional and do represent real emissions reductions. And we do need to be able to see that this is happening and that there is the transparency of governance that will give all actors confidence in the MBM. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Kat. I think for me that was a really useful reminder that this is not often, as it's simply portrayed, a game of sort of political football, but is actually highly complex in terms of the technically how we go about designing a system like this that's going to be really credible. And as a journalist, I can testify on the ICAO transparency front, because my job suddenly becomes a lot harder when I'm writing about anything to do with ICAO. But that was really useful. Thanks for that, Kat. And thanks for also mentioning forestry credits, because that brings us on nicely to our final panelist, Anna from Fern.
Great, thank you, Simon. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. There's 65 people attending, which is a really great attendance outcome. So thanks a lot to you all for joining this webinar, and thanks very much to Carbon Market Watch for organising it. I've been invited to elaborate on why we believe that forests shouldn't be included in the GMBM. But before I jump into that, just a couple of words on Fern. We're a social and environmental justice organisation. We have two headquarters, one in Brussels and one in a small little village in the UK called Morton-in-Marsh. There are 18 people working for Fern, and we work on ensuring that the EU has a positive influence on forests and on forest people's rights. So of course that means we work on EU forest policy, but it also means we work on a whole host of different policies that impact forests and forest people's rights, right from trade and investment policy to climate and energy policy to environment policy. and also on development cooperation and how member states' aid is being spent on forests. Now you'll have noticed that one of the policies that I didn't mention that we're tracking actively is transport. Maybe that's going to change. It appears it is changing, but that is the reason why this has come relatively late. The ICAO, GMBM, and all these new acronyms we've had to learn at FERN came on our plate relatively late in the day. In fact, it was the Development Cooperation Agency of an EU member state, I won't mention which one, that first put this on our agenda and mentioned that they were very concerned that it would unravel the delicate work that they had done to develop safeguards which had been developed through the UNFCCC process, which are there to safeguard the investments that are being put in projects that are supposed to be trying to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And one of the reasons why FERN was interested in taking a look a little bit more closely at this mechanism is because it would be the first compliance mechanism that would accept international forest carbon credits into its market. So neither the emissions trading system nor the California carbon market accept international forest carbon credits. And I think it's probably worth pausing during this presentation to understand, why is it that forest carbon offsets are seen as a particular, separate, different sort of an offset to the extent that they actually haven't been included as offsets in those carbon markets. So in this presentation, the sharing screen doesn't seem to be working. I can't move between my slides. Technical help, please. Can maybe if you can go through the slides on your computer. Can people still see the slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. So now you're just seeing my messy computer. So FERN was one of 100 organizations that signed on to an international declaration that was released at the beginning of April, essentially sending the message that it's not good enough, ICAO, you need to do more to reduce our emissions before you start considering this issue of offsets. If you can see in that logo in front of you a couple of well-known international federations that signed on, including Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, but also lots of small organizations from countries in the global south that signed on, as well as lots of NGOs around Europe. And essentially this letter has three main messages which will help me structure my presentation. The first is that all sectors need to make deep emission cuts to stay within our carbon budget and limit global warming. The second is that removals of CO2 from forests do not cancel out fossil fuel emissions, and hopefully my presentation will explain why. And third is that absolutely protecting forests is totally crucial to reducing climate change and limiting temperature warming, but that this must be done in addition to emissions reductions in other areas. And hopefully, I promised the other presenters, panelists, that I would end on a positive note, so I will be taking us through just a couple of what we see to be the preconditions for what is going to help keep trees standing and limit deforestation. So here you see a photo, traveled the world in December, and for those of you who were in Paris will recognize those faces on stage. Paris really changes things. We now have a much more ambitious global agreement. So instead of limiting warming to just 2 degrees, it's now well below 2 degrees, and we now need to try and limit warming to below 1.5 degrees. And that really does change things, and that's a recognition that even 2 degrees would have had a catastrophic impact. 2 degrees of warming would have had a catastrophic impact on vulnerable developing countries in the global south, but also on low-lying island nations. So achieving and honoring those goals are very, very important. And you'll see in front of you an infographic, excellent infographic done by the team at Carbon Brief that shows just how tight that carbon budget is. Essentially it means that if we continue emitting at current levels, we've got 6 years before we've blown our budget for 1.5. That's if we want to have a 66% chance we've no longer got a 90% chance of limiting to 1.5, but we could have a 66% chance. And we have 9.8 years if we want to have a 50% chance of limiting to 1.5, and so on and so forth. And what that message really tells us is that our carbon budget is just too tight now to be in a world where offsets can exist. We do need to make emissions reductions everywhere. That includes the aviation sector and includes the forest sector. And sending the message that guilt-free flying exists is simply irresponsible in a world where our carbon budget is that tight. So what that tells us, and Andrew took us through really helpfully, and what that means is essentially that we need to focus on modes of transport that are less carbon emitting. I live in Europe, I live in Paris. In fact, tonight I'm taking a sleeper train from Paris and I'm arriving in Venice tomorrow morning, but unfortunately that's a less and less frequent occurrence in Europe as sleeper services are being shut down. They're being phased out across the continent as operators are being hit by hefty taxes and of course the rise of budget airlines. So we do need to look at modes of transport that are less carbon emitting. We could also be using telecommunications, far more smartly than we are at the moment, and that's why I very much support the fact that this is a webinar and we haven't all flown to a meeting to hear us speaking. So the second thing that the second point that our letter addresses, and I really think it's time to bust the myth that forests can offset fossil fuel emissions, because it is a myth. So, and I invite you all to read this excellent report that was done by Brendan Mackey and his colleagues at the University of Griffith in Australia. It's called Untangling the Confusion Around Land Carbon Science and Climate Change Mitigation Policy. And essentially what this report does is that after 100 years, 60% of a pulse of CO2 is removed, but the remaining 40% takes centuries to millennia for it to be removed from the atmosphere to the extent that it's no longer reacting, no longer interacting with the atmosphere. And essentially this is the story of climate change. The residence time of CO2 means that we are accumulating CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's disingenuous to say that our existing forests can suck up the CO2 because they're clearly not. We are, the atmosphere is clearly warming. And it's shown quite clearly in this background carbon cycle which you see on your screens. Essentially fossil fuels are a sort of one-way arrow into the atmosphere. Forests, on the other hand, have a continual cycling of CO2 and carbon from the atmosphere into biomass and then released again. So the process of photosynthesis and respiration is a continual cycling of CO2, but it doesn't offset the burning of fossil fuels, which is, as you can see, a one-way arrow into the atmosphere. The last graph I'll show, and I don't want to be too tedious with these complicated graphs, but this is a graph taken from Mackey's article, which again I would very much implore you all to read. It's an excellent article. What you see in front of you here is essentially the message of this slide is to show that even if we replanted the planet to the extent that it was, we restored forests to their former glory to before humans evolved on the planet, this would still not remove the CO2 that we've emitted from fossil fuel emissions from the atmosphere. So in the top left-hand corner, you've got the background carbon cycle when humans were hunter-gatherers or even before humans evolved. In the top right-hand corner, you've got this shows the atmosphere during the time of when humans started to settle and there was settled agriculture. So we did start to clear forests in order to practice agriculture, and there you see a small portion of the land carbon stock released into the atmosphere, and therefore the atmospheric CO2 has increased there. In the bottom left-hand corner you see the industrial the period from the Industrial Revolution when we started digging out coal, oil and gas and started burning that, and CO2 that going into the atmosphere, and of course continued land clearing for soft commodities like palm oil and soy, etc., also going into the atmosphere. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you see this hypothetical, and of course it's a very hypothetical case because we couldn't reforest to the extent that it was before humans existed. But even in that hypothetical scenario where we did that, the CO2 that that was emitted into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels is still in the atmosphere even when the land carbon stock is entirely replenished. So what you see is the CO2 from the land carbon stock is back in the land carbon stock, but the CO2 from the fossil fuel carbon stock is in the atmosphere. So Kat already mentioned that there should be some principles for offsets, and I believe that ICAO is considering what those principles should be. I won't go into any of these in too much detail because Kat already did that much more clearly than I would be able to, but I believe that there are three that forests would have a particularly hard time in achieving. The first is around double counting, which Kat went into a lot of detail in. I guess this is particularly important, obviously, for environmental integrity, but it's particularly important for those countries in the Global South who have already committed forests and reduction of emissions from forests in their intended national determined contributions, their INDCs. And there are about 100 countries that have included land use in forests. So, of course, those countries that have committed emissions reductions from those forests can't then sell them to ICAO or any other body that's on the lookout for offsets, and to do so would be to undermine environmental integrity and cheat the atmosphere, essentially. The second principle that I think forests would have a particularly difficult time in achieving is this issue of permanence. I mean, forest and land carbon offsets are by definition reversible because of fires. So here's an example from Europe close to home. 2003 was a particularly warm winter across the globe, but especially so in Europe. Portugal has a lot of forest fires, but had particularly bad forest fires in 2003. 417,000 hectares were affected. So this is showing you the reversibility of the forest carbon stock in warmer temperatures. But there are also you know, forests reverse also because of diseases. So even closer to home, in my own country, we've got a lot of diseases currently in the forest, in the forestry sector. One of them is affecting our ash species, which are experiencing significant dieback. In 2012, it was estimated that 130,000 hectares were affected. So here we see another very clear example where forests show themselves to be entirely reversible. So due to disease, they release their CO2 back in the atmosphere. And then there comes this kind of broader question of where is the forest tipping point. As temperatures warm, precipitation levels drop, drought increases, and forests can slowly die back. And we're already starting to see signs of that in the Amazonian region. And as temperatures rise, that forest carbon stock becomes even more vulnerable to dieback. So we often talk about the importance of protecting forests to limit climate change, but there's also a reverse story to tell there, which is that in order to protect forests, we need to limit global warming. And so both are true. And therefore, hence the importance of limiting the emissions of CO2 from the atmosphere from, for example, the aviation sector. The third principle that is also inherently going to be difficult for land and forest offsets is this principle of do no harm, which you would assume that should be the bottom line for any offset, but apparently that isn't the case. In any case, land-based offset projects are never conflict-free because they involve land, which is of course a very and forests, which are very you know, prickly and sensitive issues of ownership. And essentially that's because the product that's being created and traded is the absence of an activity, which requires, of course, permanent surveillance and monitoring in order to ensure that your carbon stock is safely there. And so we have heard of a number of RED projects where forest communities and local communities have been prevented from using their forests in the way that they were used to because of a RED project. So this principle of do no harm would also be difficult for forests to abide by. I think that's probably enough bad news or negativity from my side. I wanted to end on a positive note just by briefly touching on what we do believe to be the preconditions for keeping trees standing, which is of course absolutely crucial for limiting global warming. Deforestation is the cause of 1/5 of global emissions, so it's absolutely crucial that they stay standing. The first is the first kind of foundation stone of keeping trees standing is to recognize people's rights to the forests that they live in and live near. You only have to look at a map to show that when people have clear rights over their land, trees stay standing, and also there is evidence. This excellent article, a report from the World Resources Institute, shows that there's also increased levels of carbon in forests that are owned, clearly owned by indigenous peoples. So in Brazil, deforestation in indigenous community forests was less than 1%, whereas outside of those indigenous forests, it was 7%. And the carbon inside those indigenous community forests contained 36% more carbon per hectare than other areas of the Brazilian Amazon, so it also had lower levels of degradation. The second important precondition for keeping trees standing is to improve governance. A lot of deforestation, a lot of degradation happens illegally, which means that even the countries themselves don't have the means to prevent that. So it's very important to improve governance. So really what we're talking about here is increasing transparency, reducing corruption, also increasing the civil society participation in the drafting and implementing of forest and land laws, which is something that the EU's policy to increase governance in trade, called FLEGT, Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade, has precisely tried to put communities around the same table as governments to really negotiate, what is a good forest law for that country. And yes, so a great article, report by Forest Trends released in 2014 found that half of all recent tropical deforestation has been illegal conversion for commercial agriculture. So to prevent deforestation, we really need to get after that illegality. And the third precondition for keeping trees standing is to reduce our consumption of goods that drive deforestation. So here we're talking, of course, about palm oil, soy, beef, leather, cocoa, sugar. Almost 70% of deforestation in the tropics is for commercial agriculture. And 50% of this is illegal, and the EU has a very big role to play. In that, we imported 6 billion euros worth of beef, soybeans, palm oil and leather from illegally deforested land in 2012 alone, and those are Fern's data. And the EU itself published a report that showed that it was the leading importer of goods that drive deforestation. So we import 36% of deforestation that's embodied in internationally traded agricultural commodities. So Fern Conservation International, WWF, Global Witness, Greenpeace, Forest People's Programme and Client Earth are calling on the EU to develop an action plan on deforestation in order to reduce its impact on forests. So I'm going to leave it there. I've spoken for sufficient time and hopefully that's been clear. I look forward to fielding any questions and hearing any comments. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Hannah. I think as a sort of trail through these issues, that was a really useful way to do it from Andrew's kind of putting us in context of the global climate efforts and goals, whether that's 2 degrees, keeping warming below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, and then showing us some of the specific technical elements of the GMBM, and then Hannah there just talking us through the specific issue of offsets and how forestry interacts with that. There's a number of questions already come through, so we'll move to a Q&A now. Thanks for everyone that's already submitted. I should have said at the start that this whole session is being recorded, so if you missed anything there, it will be available from Carbon Market Watch's website. Do keep questions coming. We've probably already got more than we can actually get through, but we'll do our best, and I'll try and summarize some that that tie up together. But so I think we'll start off with you, Hannah, as you just spoke, and I mean you laid out very clearly what some of the issues are around using red credits in the GMBM. But I guess I was thinking, you know, as the most obvious form of sort of massively available offset credits, forestry is obvious, and is there any way that it can be involved in a credible way, and what will you be doing if come October red credits are involved? Is there a way that red itself can be changed, or is there ways that any offset credits can be bought, for example, by making them only temporary, and you have to buy them back after a certain amount of time? Is there ways that we can establish rules that make them more credible?
Thanks, Simon. A question that journalists have asked us a lot in the past weeks after our statement. I think, and our response to them has been, until there is tangible evidence that the aviation industry is doing all it can in order to reduce emissions from aviation, and that does involve that does involve making sometimes costly improvements to engines and fuel efficiency and that kind of thing. Andrew would be the expert there. We're not in a business to be to negotiate. Obviously, we're not member states, and we're not an aviation industry, an aviation partner. But until there is any tangible evidence that there are real efforts being made to reduce emissions, we will continue to consider offsets, especially from forests, to be a dangerous distraction from the need to reduce emissions from that sector. So, of course, things can be done in order to ensure that that investments in projects to reduce emissions from forest degradation and deforestation are good investments, and you can make sure that they go towards projects that increase people's rights over land. So the money going to mapping land, or money going to helping a country really identify what the drivers are. Of course, that is all money well spent, but you will never find firms saying that that is a genuine offset from for fossil fuel emissions for the reasons that I have outlined in this presentation. So, i.e., money can be well spent, but it won't offset your emissions. It will be development aid money, which is highly necessary to keep trees standing, but it doesn't offset emissions.
And thanks. And can you also speak to some, because obviously the NGO community has been quite split on this, at the same time that you and other NGOs put out a statement in the use of red, others put out one supporting them. And I'm not asking you to do any sort of naming and shaming, but can you just guide some of us through that don't look at this every day, what those disagreements are about?
I think the main point of agreement is the need to keep trees standing, and everyone agrees with that across the board, whether you're working at Conservation International or you're working at FERN or you're working at Carbon Market, World Transport and Environment. If we want to honour the temperature targets that we've enshrined in the Paris Agreement, we need to keep trees standing. Where there is perhaps less agreement is on where the financing for that comes from. And as I've said, our position is firmly that financing needs to be additional to the existing mechanisms, so that we're not simply recycling money. So I would see that that's probably the main disagreement is around the financing.
Thanks for that, Hannah. And I mean, still speaking a bit about forestry, but I was going to ask Kat now, because obviously you mentioned forestry as something that should be included in any negative list. And I guess one thing I was just wondering through your presentation, if you said that a lot of carbon markets do use negative lists, so why does it seem that this has become such an issue for the GMBM, and why is it such a big ask? And also and there was quite a lot in the negative list, but I was thinking what can be included in an MBM?
So I mean, I think one of the reasons that we're raising the red issue very explicitly here is one of the issues that we would want, or is one of the project types that we would want excluded, is first of all for that very fundamental scientific reason that I was talking about, which is that biological and fossil carbon are two completely different carbon cycles, and Hannah also spoke to that. You have one that's stable for hundreds of millions of years, and you have one that's very vulnerable itself to climate impacts. And one of the problems or challenges with working in ICAO as compared to, say, the UNFCCC is that in the UNFCCC you have climate people who have a lot of knowledge and experience of the carbon markets, whereas ICAO doesn't have that same institutional experience, and perhaps neither do the airlines. And so there's quite a strong push, because on the face of it, it looks like a wonderful thing. You plant trees, you conserve forest, you're doing wonderful things for the environment, which are extremely important things to achieve. But and it could be good PR for the airlines. You know, it's a very good project type on the face of it. But there's this fundamental underlying scientific problem that the two forms of carbon aren't the same, and that's the fundamental basis for why we don't see that there is a role for land use offsets within the MBM, because you're offsetting kerosene emissions from airlines, a fossil, and doing it with biological carbon. Now, because there isn't that knowledge and there is that push that I think some airlines see it as good PR, and there isn't that understanding of climate in the same way within ICAO, I think those are some of the reasons why RED has come up quite actively as something that could be used. And so we're also trying to put forward the case for why it shouldn't be, on the grounds that I've just talked about. As to what are the ones that should be, obviously it's a lot harder for an NGO to talk about the positive list and what should be on the positive list. But there are certain project types that do have good sustainable development co-benefits. You know, certainly ones that help reduce poverty and you know, helping people gain access to lighting, to more efficient heating or cooling. Obviously things that could have some co-benefits if they're done in the right way.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Kat. I had another question for you actually that's come in that was about early action, and how would that work? Will it cover, for example, procurement by airlines of offsets from clean development mechanism, and under what conditions?
So there's different visions on what early action could look like, and I think there's a lot of confusion even within the discussions around it. There are some who see it as having an early decision on what project types might be or programs might be allowable, which would give a strong signal to the markets, because we're currently in a period of hiatus around certainty around the CDM. Paris didn't give any clear signals at all about where the CDM would go. There doesn't seem to be a lot of demand. There's very muted demand within the EU ETS, for instance, which is about the only source of demand at the moment. And so one vision of early action would be that an early decision would give project developers a pretty clear signal of where the market's going and to start putting some of those projects in place. Another option could be that there's an early decision that's taken and that people might be able to actually buy credits on futures markets, and so that they're not buying credits for emissions reductions that are happening now but could be buying now emissions reductions that will be happening in future. And a third option, of course, is to just, and possibly the most simple, is just limit the credits that you can buy to those that are done that are created post 2020, which would go with some of that early decision. But the way the discussion is at the moment, you would set up a body to make an early decision, and then you would set up kind of the permanent governance body that would make subsequent decisions. And I think there's a lot of lack of clarity at the moment about how these pieces fit together, and very different visions from different groups and different parties. Certainly sending signals to the market is no bad thing, and getting good clarity as long as there are good decisions made. And we would advocate going for a narrower range of options and broadening it out through time, rather than starting with a broad range and then trying to work out which are the really bad ones and winnow them back over time. But you might remember on one of my slides I talked about that we shouldn't be accepting credits from pre-2020 because of a lot of problems with certain types, and also so that you have that match between when the emission reduction happens and when it's being claimed. So, as I said, lots of different visions on early action. We would like to keep it simple, send a signal to the markets, but don't start really getting involved in the training until the market's entered into effect.
Great, thank you for that, Kat. I had a question for Andrew now, if that's all right. There's a few have actually come in that are kind of loosely jostling around this issue of regional measures outside of the MBM. So obviously there's this issue of the ETS in the EU and whether that continues, whether aviation is still under the ETS later on. And I mean, you said that there is this, you said that you think there should be, regional measures should be allowed, but I know that there's, I mean, I saw in the European Parliament last week, the Commission was debating with MEPs over this very issue, and the European Commission seemed very reticent to talk about regional measures beyond ICAO. So can you just talk about that, the importance of that, and maybe even the likelihood of that being a possibility at any stage in the future?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the starting point for us is the more that's done at a global international level, the less it has to be done by regions or states. So I think our focus, and I think those in the European Commission would share this, is that the period now until October is to get the best possible deal out of ICAO. And that involves sticking to carbon neutral growth from 2020, and then identifying sort of a clear ratchet and review mechanism which would increase ambition in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. I think once the assembly is over, we can sort of revisit that question and take a closer look at what should happen at a European level. But what we do know from the current draft and how difficult it is to get agreement even on carbon neutral growth 2020 is that relying on sort of one-size-fits-all global, a single one-size-fits-all global measure to ensure international aviation makes its contribution to the Paris Agreement, I think isn't going to be sufficient. So the obvious question is, well, what do you do beyond the GMBM? Now, I mean, industry would say, and this is certainly a viewpoint being advanced, for example, by the US, is that you just stick to one measure and you make it as good as possible. I think when it comes to climate policy, you need to pursue as many measures as possible. That includes, to some respects, promoting alternative fuels. And it means increasing the ambition of the GMBM. But I think there is a role for regional measures like the ETS to continue with in some existence, at least for inter-EU level, to ensure adequate ambition. We know inter-EU ETS is an effective market-based mechanism. It's been responsible for about 16 million ton reductions per year since it was introduced, just on inter-EU level. And we also know it's in keeping with what's happening with the international aviation market. So, for example, China is looking to put its domestic aviation market into its own domestic ETS scheme. So we're already moving to a world where there could be one ICAO global scheme and then domestic or regional measures at European and Chinese level. And for us, that offers one way of ensuring an adequate contribution by international aviation. But you know, a more definite answer, I think, will be available after the assembly when we see what ICAO has come up with.
Thank you. I mean, building on this idea of regional measures, somebody had asked, they've been in a meeting in Buenos Aires, and there is talk there of looking at kind of citywide measures, I suppose, and they asked, is there a fair way for cities to measure their own aviation emissions, and is that something we need to be thinking about, or are we going too small then at the regional level? That's to Andrew.
I think that might be a little too difficult, because even here looking at Brussels, you could shift traffic from Brussels-Zaventem to Charleroi Airport, and is that measured as Charleroi City or Brussels City? That's probably a little too difficult. I mean, what is very relevant for cities is the air quality issues that come with aviation, air and noise issues. And as aviation expands, it's becoming a more pressing issue for cities across the world. And I mean, that's a separate issue, but also quite relevant for environment and public health issues.
Thanks for that. I also had a question for you, Andrew, on technical improvements, because as a journalist that deals with both NGOs and then business and people within member states, I hear quite a lot often about technical improvements and how that's going to, and the role that that's going to have in the future. And it's often quite difficult to unpick really how far that can take us in terms of emissions reductions. I mean, you mentioned it a bit in your slide, but I mean specifically whether it's design of aircraft or whether it's alternative fuels. Yeah, what is the potential, say, in 50 years' time for this to really help in terms of reducing emissions, or do we really at some point need to be talking about just reducing the amount of flights we're doing?
So, I mean, it's very hard to predict what it's going to be like in 30 or 40 years' time. There's always the potential that some fantastic technology will come along and will solve this problem. That's what some would kind of describe as the technology myth idea, that something will happen that will resolve the problem. But we've kind of been through this a long while. So in recent years, you've seen this idea that alternative fuels will come available in sufficient supply, that you'll have blended wing design aircraft, that these will come along. I mean, that's kind of speculation and sort of a guessing game. I mean, what we do know is happening is that the size of the global commercial aviation fleet, it's about 16,000 aircraft now. That's going to expand to about 30,000 aircraft by 2030. And that's going to result in a substantial increase in emissions if they rely entirely or exclusively on fossil fuels. And we know what's happening in terms of technology gains in the aviation sector. Yes, there are some gains, but they are, as standard technology design continues, those efficiency gains are getting harder and harder to come by. So ICAO have this target of 2% a year, IATA 1.5% a year. If you look at I think one study done by the International Council for Clean Transportation, they said it's really closer to 1.1% a year. And it's likely to either stay that low or decline if low oil prices continue in the coming years. And that's problematic because that leads to an emissions gap. You have passenger growth of around 4 or 5% a year. So if you have technological improvements of 1 or less than 2% a year, you obviously have growing emissions every year, and that goes against the Paris Agreement's objective that emissions peak and then start to rapidly decline. And that's just aircraft design. I mean, it's the same uncertainty exists for alternative fuels. There are some exciting developments on a small scale, but we don't know how possible it will be to upscale them and ensure that those fuels continue to be sustainable. And as for operational improvements, I mean, there's a limit to how efficient you can make airspace. You can improve it, and then the problem with that is you will also suffer what's known as the rebound effect, where increased efficiencies result in a more efficient flight, which results in cheaper tickets, which stimulates further demand. So I don't think we can just kind of rely on sort of unspecified kind of technology to come along and save it, particularly because we know emissions have to peak in the short term and then decline if 1.5 is to have any possibility of being achieved.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I'll move on to some of the slightly more specific questions, and I tried to summarize some of those in the last few. But one here for Kat, it's about governance. Somebody's asked who should be responsible for governance of the GMBM relating to emissions units, criteria, and MRV, for example.
Okay, so I think this is going to be one of those things that requires cooperation at different levels, and there's lots of different types of governance that will be needed within the MBM. So I know there's discussions about who monitors the reporting by airlines of what they're buying, or how much they're buying at least. I think it's definitely within ICAO's remit to decide which emissions units it deems credible, and which is why that we're putting such an emphasis on the discussions around credit quality and the types of projects we would not want to see on the negative list. And I think there's some issues in terms of the registries and others that might be perhaps better organised within the UNFCCC, that ICAO can make sure and collaborate with those discussions to ensure that the two systems talk to each other, and that there is that communication to ensure that double counting doesn't occur. So I think it's a question that kind of needs to be broken down a little bit by what exactly you're MRVing and what exactly you're governing.
Thanks for that, Kat. A question that's just come up. I suppose it could go to Andrew, because it's about non-CO2 emissions. There was a question right at the start about your graph. It says the graph only includes CO2 emissions, and And does ignoring non-CO2 emissions impact? Would it make the that graph you showed look considerably different? And there's also somebody's also asked why non-CO2 emissions have not been not been mentioned in the open letter. I'm not sure if that just means other GHG emissions or if we're talking about pollutants there, but maybe you can just help us out in some of that, Andrew.
Yeah, so from a climactic point of view, the graph there just relates to CO2 emissions. But as for the impact of those CO2 emissions on the planet, yes, they would be higher if you take into account non-CO2 emissions. I mean, part of the reticence to address the non-CO2 effects is because there has been a degree of scientific uncertainty as to what exactly they are. I alluded earlier to a study done by David Lee, who is one of the leading scientists on this. He advises the UK government, is based with the Manchester Metropolitan University. If you just kind of Google his study on radiative forcing, which is what this is known as, it accepts that there is kind of a broad range of estimates. So I say 4.95% is an estimate, but it could be lower, it could be higher. I think what our solution to do is to, at the very least, adopt a conservative estimate and work on that basis. And that's entirely possible to address with the global MBM through discounting. So you just ask for 2 offsets instead of 1, and that more closely reflect the climate impact of aviation. As for why it wasn't included in the open letter, I don't know. I think at ICAO we've been so busy just trying to focus on the CO2 effects that maybe it's slightly overlooked our radar a little bit. But it certainly is something that should be addressed, and hopefully will be either by ICAO or through other measures.
Okay, thanks for that. I think we're slightly running out of time now, and I think we've gone through I've tried to cover most of the questions. There's a few other very specific ones, and I'll see if we can discuss maybe putting those to some of the panelists by email. It might take me a while to read them out over the webinar. So I think we'll come to a close there, but thank you very much for everyone that's attended and for anyone that submitted questions, and especially thank you to Andrew, Kat and Hannah for all your insights. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's anything else we wanted to add from Carbon Market Watch.
No, just further thanks to everyone who's participated, and of course also to our speakers.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.